Last couple of issues. Let's talk about something called net domestic product. If we have gross domestic product, there's also a net domestic product. Net of anything means you've subtracted something, right? Like the net weight on a can. There's what, a 16-ounce can of vegetables, and of course the can itself weighs something. So if you actually put it on a scale, it would weigh more than 15 ounces. It might weigh 16 ounces. But then you subtract out the weight of the can and you get 15 ounces of content. So using that concept, the net domestic product is gross domestic product minus depreciation. What's depreciation? Well, things wear out. All goods and services, all capital equipment, everything wears out. So depreciation measures the decline in the value of capital. That's our main goal for depreciation. So the net domestic product is the amount of output available for consumption without reducing the capital stock. Let's go to the next slide. We'll make sense out of the statement. Okay, let's take a look at the distinction between gross domestic product and net domestic product. Let's think about an actual practical example and think about investing in new equipment. Picture yourself as the owner of a fleet of trucks. You're in the trucking business and you own 10 18-wheelers. But it turns out that when they're on the road, roughly every 10 years, you pile up a million miles and the truck essentially becomes worthless. It breaks down so often you don't want it anymore and it's sent to the scrap yard and then you buy a new truck. Okay? So let's take a look at gross investment. Investment by definition means a business person has invested in new capital equipment, which for a practical thing in our example is they bought a new truck. Now, gross investment means how many trucks did you buy this period? Or to be more abstract, what was the total investment expenditure? How much did business people spend on purchasing investment equipment? Net investment is gross investment less depreciation. Let me show you why this is important. You have a 10-truck fleet. Every year, one of the trucks finally reaches its million miles and becomes worthless. So if you did nothing, if you bought no new trucks, you would start with 10 trucks last year, you'd have 9 trucks this year, you'd have 8 trucks the year after that, because one of them would always be dropping out as it aged out. So what if you actually bought a new truck this year? Remember, you have a 10-truck fleet and you bought a new truck. Do you have 11 trucks? No, you don't. You have 10 trucks plus 1, sounds like 11, but you also had one wear out and you lost 1 truck. So it turns out that gross investment and net investment aren't the same thing. If we took the gross investment, which was we added 1 more truck, and subtracted out the depreciation, which means we lost 1 truck, what did we actually gain here? The answer would be 0. We had no new truck. The size of our fleet did not increase. So how do you make the size of your fleet increase? Well, obviously your gross investment has to be larger than your depreciation, and that is possible. Again, go back to our example. You start off with a fleet of 10 trucks. You invest in 2 new trucks this year. One of the older trucks finally breaks down and you scrap it. So you bought 2 new trucks. At the end of the year, how many trucks do you have? You only have 11. You have a gross investment of 2 new trucks minus the depreciation of losing 1 truck. So you would have a net new addition of 1 truck to your fleet. So now you have an 11-truck fleet. So does it make sense to everybody? In order for your trucking fleet to grow, you have to invest at a higher rate than the depreciation. In other words, gross investment has to be larger than depreciation to have a net increase in the total amount of capital. And that's our 2 final bullet points. When the net investment is positive, meaning you're investing in more trucks than you are wearing trucks out, the trucking fleet grows. Do it for the entire economy. When net investment for the economy is positive, the economy grows. And vice versa. When net investment is negative, the economy declines. And net investment can be negative even when gross investment is positive. Let me give you a different example with our 10-truck fleet. What if you were in the situation where it turns out that 2 trucks wear out per year? Okay? So now we have a serious problem, right? If you invest in 1 new truck per year, but you're wearing out 2 trucks per year, is the size of your fleet rising, staying the same, or falling? Does everyone recognize it would start to fall? So That's what we want you all to recognize. For an economy as a whole, we invest in more than just trucks, right? There's all kinds of equipment. But just like trucks, all that equipment is wearing out. So in order for our society to have more and more and more capital equipment to work with, the total gross investment must be larger than net investment. Otherwise, the total amount of capital equipment goes down and our economy goes down. Next, let's remind ourselves about something. We talked earlier when we were discussing the concepts of the three major questions all societies have to answer. The what will we produce, the how will we produce it, and then for whom will we produce it, all has to be answered. Let's go back to that what to be produced question. It turns out that we have major categories that economists have broken down that what into kind of like subcategories. The first subcategory we're going to look at is the largest category, and it's called consumption, the letter C, as you can see in abbreviation there, in parentheses there. So goods and services used by households are the goods that we call consumption goods, and it makes up about a little over 2/3 of the economy. So the biggest chunk of the U.S. economy is geared toward producing consumer goods. So what determined what consumer goods there should be and how many goods should be consumer goods? Well, consumers determine that by what they spend their money on. Since every consumer has control of their own income in a capitalist society, we recognize that consumption is driven by consumer decisions. The next thing we're going to consider is business people also spend money, but they spend money on machinery. In this case, plant machinery and equipment, which we called capital goods. So the investment is we usually abbreviate the letter I to capture the spending on investment. That makes up about 1/6 of GDP. And in the macro sense of the word, in the use that we put it for in this class, as opposed to a finance class, for instance, investment here means strictly buying the plant machinery and the equipment. Now, in a finance class, we would talk about buying stocks and bonds. But remember, those are only mechanisms to transfer money to a company where the company goes out and buys the plant machinery and equipment. So ultimately, investment means buying the plant machinery and equipment, setting it up, and then, obviously running some kind of system. The third major category of spending is government spending, which we're going to abbreviate as G in parentheses there. So these are resources purchased by the public sector. This is not total government expenditures, and this causes a little bit of confusion. Expenditures are the total amount of checks governments write. But a big bunch of those checks are checks like for Social Security, where the government does not actually buy food, groceries, housing, or anything else for older people. They send them a check. And then the individuals make the decision of, do I buy clothing? Do I buy food? Do I go on vacation with the money? Whatever it is that elderly people on Social Security do. So when we say government spending here, we're talking about specifically expenditures on goods and services. So the government spends money on the public sector, such as hiring firemen, hiring school teachers, hiring police officers, hiring army officers, purchasing tanks, purchasing airplanes, purchasing, you could imagine all the different things governments purchase in order to run the public sector. So that's what government spending means, the direct spending by government for actual goods and services. We'll see later on in a different section, we'll discuss government expenditures that are spent on transfer payments. And then last but not least, our last category is something called net exports. And every time you see the word net, you know that you're subtracting one thing from another. So net exports are exports minus imports. So we abbreviate exports as the letter X, imports are the letter M. And so the value of the exports minus the imports is the amount of money we spend on other things in our society, the import things. Now, let's go ahead and define that net exports in a little bit more detail. We've already mentioned that the imports are abbreviated M. What does that mean? Now, most of us know what that means, but let's just go back and make sure that everyone is in agreement. So, imports are goods and services that are made in a foreign land or a foreign country, but purchased in the United States. Let me give you a classic example. Volvo cars are made in Sweden and then imported into the United States or exported from Sweden, because that's what exports means, our next bullet point. Exports, which we abbreviate as the letter X, are goods and services produced in the United States but purchased by foreign lands. So an example there would be a Caterpillar tractor bulldozer. So Caterpillar makes huge equipment. They make it here in the United States, and then we sell it to foreign construction companies that want to build roads or whatever in some other country. So every country both imports and exports. Now, of course, some countries are more open to this than other countries, but virtually every country in the world has some imports and some exports. Now, we add exports to our GDP. Why? Let's think about this, the measurement issue I'm talking about. Remember, one of the things I mentioned, we usually add up the GDP by going around to all the cash registers, making sure we're only dealing with the final goods, cash registers, not the intermediate goods, to make sure we don't double count, but we add up all the goods that are being sold. Okay, now the problem, of course, is at what cash register in the US are we selling Caterpillar tractors? Well, we're not, right? So if we use the method I just mentioned, we would not actually add the exports into GDP. So now this is how we do it. We keep track of all the exports and say, oh, if we exported it, and then by definition we produced it here, we should be measuring it as part of our GDP. And then next, we subtract imports from our GDP. And let's think about the logic there. Remember, we have government officials going around checking on, asking businesses, what did you sell as final goods and services? And let's assume they go to a Volvo dealer here in the United States and say, well, how many dollars worth of cars did you sell? And the car dealer says, I sold $5 million worth of Volvos. Should that be counted as US GDP? Well, of course not. So here's the problem. Under the consumption tab that we had talked about on the or consumption category that we talked about on the previous slide, we're going to be claiming that we need to add up all these consumer items as part of our GDP. And then, of course, when we do that, Volvos get added in. But then when we recognize the Volvos weren't made here, they were made in Sweden, what's the next logical step? Now you subtract out those imported goods because they were made somewhere else. So the difference between exports and imports is called net exports X minus M. Now let's get to something called GDP components. We're going to take every one of these subcategories that we just mentioned and put them all together. It turns out the value of the GDP can be computed by adding up all these expenditures. So all the expenditures on final goods and services, which we call consumption, C, plus all the money that business people spent on new equipment and new factory buildings, plus all the money the government spent on hiring police officers and buying them police cars and paying for ambulance services and all the fire department services, all those things will be what the government ends up producing. And then exports minus imports gives a net number of how many things did we produce here and export overseas, and then subtract out all the things that we've accidentally added into the system, but they really should not be counted because they're produced by a foreign country. You put all these together, C plus I plus G plus net exports gives you the total GDP of the country. Okay? So this is one of those things that you should just memorize. The C plus I plus G plus X minus M will turn out to be a very useful formula because it helps us understand out of the total GDP some major subcomponents and where those subcomponents are going. So now that we're going to take a look at is there are two ways to measure GDP. We can measure on the expenditure side, which we call the demand side. In other words, how do we know how much stuff the country produced? Well, go figure out all the things people bought, all the new things people bought. But do you all recognize that if you bought a new thing, someone had to make it? And so if you're buying it from an American manufacturer who made it in the United States, then by definition, the amount that you spent on those goods is the amount that it took to produce those goods. Okay? So GDP is now going to be measured by adding up all the expenditures on the consumer goods, the investment goods, the government-sponsored goods, and then the exports minus imports. So measuring expenditures is measuring the C plus I plus G plus net exports. Another way of doing it is measuring income. Now here's the interesting issue that we did not spend a lot of time on, but we did mention it when we did the circular flow diagram. It turns out that the total amount of money spent on expenditures is simultaneously the total amount of money that flows back to people as income. Let's do a quick example to prove that to be true. Let's assume that you just went to Costco and bought a $1,000 big screen TV. Okay? Now, let's assume, just to make it simple, that the TV was produced here in the United States. So, out of that $1,000 that Costco collects, where does all that money go to? Well, first of all, you have to pay for the manufacture of the TV by paying for labor, right? You also have to, so that would be income to workers. You also have to pay for rent or mortgage payment on your building. So that's income to landlords. You also have to pay interest on the money you borrowed to finance your factory. That's money to investors and bankers. And then you have to pay money to the owner of the company. That's called profit. And so that's income to the owner of the business. So it turns out that if you add up all those different incomes, you will end up with $1,000. And it has to be true, because let's assume you spent, what, 600 on labor, 200 on the factory building, 100 on, let's see, what else, on interest. That would get you up to $900. Then whatever's left over of the 1,000, that would be another $100. That's profit. Who does the profit go to? Well, it goes to the owner as income. So we recognize that no matter what you do, ultimately all of the money spent on the TV has to end up as income to somebody, right? Either workers or the owners of the company, or interest to the bank, or money to the landlord. One way or the other, all income spent on a good or a service, which is the expenditure, ends up as income to someone else. The reason why we're hammering this issue is it turns out that once you recognize this issue, once you know the GDP output number, dollar of output number, you also know the dollar of income number, because all dollars of output is equal to dollars of income to somebody in the economy. Let's go through an example here, just to illustrate this point. On the left-hand side, we have the total expenditures using the C plus I plus G plus net exports mechanism I just mentioned to you. And if you look at our particular economy back in 2019 for the U.S., U.S. consumers spent around $14.5 trillion on goods and services for consumers. Business people spent about $3.7 trillion on investment goods. Government spent about the same amount of money on purchases that governments make for actual goods and services, such as, like I said, fire department services by hiring firemen, things like that. And then, of course, the net exports, we produced $2.5 trillion worth of machinery and stuff to export to foreigners, and then we purchased from foreigners $3.136 trillion worth of stuff. So we have to make sure we take that out of the numbers so we don't give credit to the U.S. when the credit actually should go to the foreign country that produced the good. It turns out in 2019, that gives us a total GDP, or a total production, of $21.427 trillion. U.S. economy is pretty big. 21 trillion is a lot of money. So anyway, that's the size of our economy measured on the production side or the expenditure side. Now, let's go to the income side and figure out what was the income for the United States. In the United States, wages and salaries ended up being $11 trillion. Corporate profits around $2 trillion. Proprietor's income, that would be the owner of a small business, like let's say you own a landscaping business. You make a profit, but so instead of putting that under wages, because if you actually own the building, it's not wages, we usually call it proprietor's income. So self-employed people have proprietor's income. Rents of $700 billion, interest of $645 billion, and then some other numbers that we'll get into later on why those numbers are actually added in. But for now, just take my word for it, they are a mechanism to keep track of the total income in the United States. So you notice that the total income is $21.427 trillion, which is equal to the total value of the output of $21.427 trillion. So income and output are the same thing, just looking at different sides of the same coin, so to speak. There's the tail side, there's the head side of the coin, but they're both part of the same coin. Like I said, the reason why we're making a big production out of this is Once you know what the total output of a society is, you also know what the total income of a society is. So when I tell you that a particular country has X billions of dollars of production of GDP, you also know that country has X billion dollars worth of income. And that's, of course, I'm just going to quickly go through this one. It doesn't make sense to spend a lot of time. We've just demonstrated that output and income are essentially the same thing. So we're going to go ahead and leave the slide at that point and move on to our next set of slides.